The quiet town of Albuquerque, Spain, would never be the same after the tragic discovery in the rectory of St. Agnes Church. It was here that a forbidden romance spiraled into a web of deceit, betrayal, and, ultimately, bloodshed. The body of Father Mateo Alvarez was found on the cold stone floor, a single puncture wound ending his life and shocking a town that had revered him. What lay behind his murder was a dark and forbidden affair, with a young woman desperate for survival. Father Mateo Alvarez had always been a figure of unwavering faith, a beacon for the people of Albuquerque, Spain. At 42, he had spent nearly 15 years in this quiet town, becoming not only a spiritual guide, but also a dependable fixture in the lives of the townspeople. Those who knew him saw him as a humble man, carrying himself with a calm dignity that gave comfort to those in need. He led a simple life, devoting himself entirely to his faith and the welfare of his congregation, often sacrificing his own needs to serve others. Yet, beneath his composed exterior, there was an undercurrent of loneliness that he had long kept hidden. Mateo had entered the priesthood in his early 20s, drawn by a powerful calling and a desire to dedicate his life to something greater. However, over the years, he began to feel the strain of the isolation that came with his role. He saw families gather each Sunday, couples and children filing into the pews with smiles and laughter. They found companionship, and he, in contrast, returned each night to the quiet rectory, where the only sound was the ticking of an old clock by his bedside. Despite his spiritual strength, Mateo was a man like any other, and the solitude weighed on him in ways he struggled to understand. He could not speak of these feelings to anyone, nor could he allow himself to entertain them for long. His identity as a priest was deeply ingrained, and he saw it as his purpose to carry this burden without complaint. Meanwhile, in the same town, Lucia Morales, a young immigrant from Colombia, was facing a life defined by struggle and uncertainty. At 26, she had already experienced more hardship than most. She had fled Colombia a few years earlier, escaping the crushing poverty and violence that had left her family destitute. In her search for a better life, she had risked everything to cross borders, arriving in Spain with no papers and no certainty of what awaited her. She took whatever work she could find, often cleaning houses or taking on the most labor-intensive tasks just to make a small income. Her days were filled with the exhaustion of physical labor, and her nights were spent in a small, cramped apartment she shared with other immigrants, each of them carrying their own stories of desperation and hope. Lucia's connection to her homeland was still strong, but the pain of leaving behind her family was something she carried daily. She had siblings to think of, siblings who depended on the small amounts of money she could send back home. But she also knew that without legal status, her situation in Spain was precarious. The constant fear of deportation haunted her, turning her life into a series of anxious, careful movements. She had to remain invisible, blending into the background, never drawing attention to herself. Every day felt like walking a tightrope, with one misstep enough to send her back to the life she had escaped. In the early January 2009, Lucia started attending services at St. Agnes Church, not only for the spiritual comfort, but for a sense of safety and community. Father Mateo noticed her almost immediately. She was a quiet figure, always sitting in the back pew, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes fixed on the altar, with an intensity that betrayed her desperation. Her presence touched something deep within Matteo. He saw in her a reflection of his own silent struggles, an unspoken bond that needed no words. She came to him during confession one evening, her voice trembling as she recounted her hardships. She spoke about her family, her fears, and her loneliness. And Matteo listened with an empathetic ear, offering her words of comfort and support. Over the following weeks, their interactions grew more frequent. Matteo started to extend small gestures of kindness to her, simple acts that carried great meaning for both of them. He would slip her a few coins for food, offer her small bags of rice and bread, and ask if there was anything more he could do to help. These exchanges were brief, barely lasting more than a few moments, but each one deepened the connection between them. Matteo justified these actions to himself as charity, a part of his duty as a priest, but inside he felt a pull he couldn't ignore. Lucia, for her part, began to sense Matteo's vulnerability. She saw how he lingered in their conversations, how his eyes softened when he listened to her speak about her hardships. She recognized the loneliness in him, and though she had never intended to manipulate, she found herself leaning on him more and more. She would share more of her life, reveal intimate details that stirred compassion within him. She painted a picture of a woman trapped by her circumstances, and Matteo, believing he was helping her out of kindness, was slowly being drawn into a bond that blurred the boundaries he had so carefully maintained. By early February, their meetings became routine. Each evening, after he had finished his duties, Matteo would find her waiting in the shadows outside the church, a delicate figure cloaked in the dimming light. She would tell him about her day, about the fears she carried, and he would listen, offering reassurances and support that grew increasingly personal. He found himself longing for these encounters, waiting for the end of each day, when he could sit with her, just the two of them, away from prying eyes. One evening, Lucia gently took his hand, a simple gesture that sent a shiver through him. He felt a strange warmth, a yearning he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. It was then that he understood how deep his connection to her had grown. He knew the implications, the risks, and the guilt that would come with crossing this boundary. Yet, in that moment, his resolve weakened, his conscience clouded by emotions he had kept locked away. Their affair began that night, cloaked in secrecy, and marked by the intensity of forbidden passion. They would meet in the silence of the rectory, where they could be alone, away from the world that would judge them harshly. For Matteo, each encounter was a struggle between guilt and desire, a complex mixture of longing and shame. He convinced himself that he was only providing comfort, that this was a fleeting connection that would eventually pass. But the more he tried to rationalize, the deeper he fell, entangled in a web of emotions that left him questioning everything he believed. For Lucia, the affair was a lifeline, a way to secure her place and her safety. She felt relief in his embrace, knowing that his support could mean a future free from the fear of deportation. Her dependence on him grew, not just as a lover, but as a source of stability in her uncertain life. Their connection became a lifeline for both, binding them together in ways that neither fully understood, but from which neither could escape. By late February, their meetings had become a regular, unspoken part of their lives. The people of Albuquerque began to notice the subtle changes in Father Mateo. He seemed more withdrawn, his usually calm demeanor tinged with an uncharacteristic restlessness. In the rectory, behind closed doors, they lived their affair in secret, both knowing that a single misstep could bring everything crashing down. Yet, for all the fear and guilt, neither was willing to let go, bound by a connection that felt both vital and dangerous. In the shadow of the confessional where they had first met, their forbidden relationship grew, hidden but intense, setting the stage for a tragedy that neither could foresee. Father Mateo's once unshakable sense of purpose and direction began to falter in the early weeks of February 2009. Every day, he grappled with his conscience, haunted by the weight of his secret life. The forbidden relationship with Lucia had filled a void in his life, but it now felt like a burden, one that grew heavier with each passing day. He would wake in the stillness of the rectory, feeling a profound sense of regret, his mind clouded with thoughts of failure. The sanctity of his vows, the promises he had made, and the responsibility he bore to his congregation seemed to unravel under the strain of his hidden affair. Mateo spent hours each morning in silent prayer, kneeling before the altar, seeking the strength to resist the desires that had taken hold of him. He would ask for guidance, for the power to end the relationship before it destroyed him entirely. Yet, when he saw Lucia, all his resolutions faded. Her presence was magnetic, a force that pulled him back every time he tried to pull away. He felt captivated, torn between his love for God and his inexplicable connection to her. It was as though she had become an integral part of his life, someone he could neither hold on to nor let go of. Lucia sensed the change in him, her intuition picking up on his reluctance and growing doubts. She knew the affair could not last forever, but she also feared what would happen if Mateo abandoned her. Without him, her life felt uncertain, vulnerable, and exposed. She depended on his support, not only financially, but as a source of stability and protection in a life marked by unpredictability. When he began to pull away, her desperation grew. She felt as though her lifeline was slipping, and with it, any hope for a secure future. Their interactions grew strained. Where once there was warmth, there was now tension. Mateo became more distant, his responses cautious and controlled, and the affection that once filled their meetings was now marred by hesitation. Lucia responded by pressing him further, hinting that she needed more from him. She mentioned how difficult it was to live without proper documentation, how the constant fear of deportation wore her down, and she began to suggest he help her obtain papers or provide more financial support. She would ask in ways that seemed casual but carried a subtle urgency. Mateo, already overwhelmed by guilt, felt trapped by her requests. He knew he couldn't provide what she was asking, but refusing her seemed equally impossible. He could see the tension building in her, the disappointment in her eyes each time he hesitated. She began appearing at unexpected times, coming to the rectory unannounced and asking for him, her face a mixture of anxiety and frustration. Her once gentle demeanor grew erratic, her words charged with unspoken accusations, her glances more intense. Occasionally, she made veiled suggestions that if he didn't help her, she would find another way to secure her future. Hints that left him unsettled, aware of how precarious their situation had become. As February passed, Matteo's internal turmoil reached a breaking point. He realized that the only solution was to end the affair entirely, to cut ties with Lucia and recommit himself to the path he had once walked with conviction. The strain was unbearable. He could no longer live with the double life, the fear, and the constant sense of betrayal toward his faith. One late February night, after hours of sleeplessness and restless prayer, he made his decision. He would end it, for his own sake and for hers, convinced that continuing would only lead to more suffering. But even as he reached this conclusion, he knew Lucia would not let go easily. When he finally told her of his decision, her reaction was immediate and intense. She didn't accept his choice with quiet resignation, but instead with a raw display of anger and heartbreak. She pleaded with him, trying to remind him of everything they had shared, the closeness they had felt. Her desperation was apparent, as she insisted that she needed him, that without him she was lost. But Matteo held firm, determined to put a stop to what had grown out of control. Yet, as her pleas turned to threats, he felt a new sense of fear. She hinted that if he abandoned her, she would not keep silent, that she would reveal everything to the townspeople, even to the church. Her words echoed in his mind, filling him with dread. She would ruin him if he refused to stay, and the thought terrified him. Left with no other choice, Matteo made the drastic decision to contact a friend in immigration enforcement. He reasoned that, by reporting her, he could sever the connection without facing the public consequences of her threats. He told himself that Lucia might even find help through official channels, that the authorities could provide her with what he could not. But this decision haunted him deeply. On March 3rd, he placed the call, but as soon as he hung up, he felt the weight of his actions bearing down on him. What had he done? Had he truly condemned her to a life of hardship just to free himself from his guilt? On the March 5th, Matteo arranged to meet Lucia one last time in the rectory. His mind was clouded with anxiety as he awaited her arrival, knowing this would be the final step in ending their entanglement. As the door opened and Lucia entered, he could sense the tension in the air, thick and almost suffocating. He struggled to maintain his composure as he explained his decision, his voice steady but heavy with the finality of his words. He told her he had done what he needed to do, hoping she would understand that there was no other way. The atmosphere was tense, silent for a few moments, as the realization sank in for Lucia. But instead of understanding, her reaction was explosive, a wave of fury and betrayal that surged through her. She looked at him, her eyes wild with disbelief and rage. All at once, the desperation she had held back erupted in a fit of fury. Without warning, she reached for the nearest object, a heavy brass candlestick, and brought it down on him with the force of her anger and heartbreak. The first blow stunned him, and, in the brief moment of confusion, she grabbed a letter opener from his desk and plunged it into him. The act was swift but brutal. Matteo fell to the ground, his life ebbing away as his blood stained the cold stone floor of the rectory. His last moments were a mixture of shock, pain, and a tragic sense of loss, as he realized the full cost of the choices they had both made. Lucia, standing over him, felt the weight of what she had done settle upon her, a silence that held nothing but the finality of their story. On the early morning of March 6th, the church caretaker, an elderly man named Don Luis, arrived at St. Agnes as he had every morning for the past 20 years. He was a quiet figure in the town, known for his devotion to the church and his punctuality. As he unlocked the doors and began his rounds, he felt a strange chill in the air. The rectory was unusually silent, and there was a faint, metallic smell lingering. A scent he could not place, but that instinctively filled him with unease. As he moved toward Father Mateo's private quarters, he noticed that the door was slightly ajar, a small detail that felt wrong to him. Father Mateo was meticulous, careful with even the smallest details, never one to leave a door carelessly open. Hesitantly, Don Luis stepped into the room, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the narrow window. Then he saw it. Father Mateo lay motionless on the cold stone floor, his body lifeless, a dark pool of blood around him. The sight was horrifying, and the shock that rippled through Don Luis rendered him speechless for several long moments. When he finally managed to move, he ran outside, calling for help, his cries breaking the morning's silence. By the time the police arrived, the news had already begun to spread. The once peaceful grounds of St. Agnes were soon swarmed with officers, medical personnel, and curious townsfolk who gathered anxiously outside, whispering to each other in hushed tones. The small town had never seen such a tragedy, and the community was in shock, struggling to understand how this could have happened to the man they revered as their moral guide. Inside the rectory, the police began their grim work, documenting every detail of the scene. The initial examination suggested a violent struggle, evidenced by the overturned chair and shattered glass on the floor. Their eyes fell on the table where 2 wine glasses sat, one still half full, a silent witness to an intimate encounter gone horribly wrong. The officers exchanged glances, sensing that this was no ordinary crime. They could see that Father Mateo's death was not just an attack, but something far more personal, a betrayal. The town was left reeling, and the whispers began almost immediately. The townspeople, who had known Father Mateo as a pillar of strength, were torn between grief and a growing sense of confusion. They struggled to reconcile the image of their trusted priest with the dark implications that his violent end suggested. Rumors swirled about secret liaisons, late-night visitors, and hushed conversations in the shadowed corners of the church. The mystery surrounding Father Mateo's death gripped the town, with every new piece of information only deepening the scandal. On March 8th, the police intensified their investigation, focusing on those who had been close to Father Mateo. They questioned the church staff, members of the congregation, and even Don Luis, hoping to find clues that would unravel the mystery. It wasn't long before they began to hear stories of a young woman seen near the rectory in recent months. Several locals, reluctant at first, finally admitted they had noticed a woman visiting the church, slipping into the shadows around the time Father Mateo would retire for the night. She was described as quiet, reserved, and beautiful, with a look of sadness that seemed out of place in the sleepy town. As the police dug deeper, they found incriminating evidence. A series of letters, notes Lucia had left for Father Mateo, hidden away in his desk drawer. The letters spoke of longing, of the pain of separation, and hinted at moments of tension between them. The relationship was more complicated than anyone had imagined, with hints of desperation and passion woven through each line. Each letter painted a picture of a relationship that had grown from kindness into something forbidden, and eventually something dangerous. By March 12th, the police had pieced together enough to form a clearer picture of what had transpired. The townsfolk were horrified to learn that the young woman was none other than Lucia Morales, an undocumented immigrant who had come to their town a year prior. Some recalled seeing her around the church, often keeping to herself. They remembered how she had seemed to linger a bit too long after services, her eyes occasionally drifting toward Father Mateo in a way that now seemed all too clear. The affair between a respected priest and a vulnerable immigrant shocked the town to its core, the scandal unfolding like something out of a tragic story. On the March 20th, with the evidence mounting, the police issued an arrest warrant for Lucia. The small police station, usually a quiet place, was soon filled with the murmurs of journalists and locals who had come to witness the arrest. The affair was now more than a rumor. It was a story of betrayal and blood, a scandal that tore through the town's moral fabric. Lucia's arrest sparked a media frenzy. Reporters descended on Albuquerque, eager to capture every sordid detail of the forbidden affair. The townspeople, once proud of their close-knit community, now found themselves under the scrutiny of the outside world, their private tragedy turned into a spectacle. At her arraignment, Lucia showed no signs of remorse. Her face was impassive, her gaze steady as she faced the judge. When questioned, she insisted that she had acted out of fear, that she had felt betrayed, abandoned by the man she had come to depend on. She claimed that she had been pushed to extremes, that her actions were a result of desperation rather than malice. The trial began in late April, and each day the courtroom was packed with spectators, eager to hear the latest revelations. As the prosecution presented its case, they revealed the letters, the wine glasses, and the testimonies of those who had seen Lucia and Mateo together. Each piece of evidence chipped away at the townspeople's former reverence for their priest, exposing the layers of secrets that had led to his tragic end. Some people in the town could not believe the reality unfolding before them, struggling to accept that the man they had admired had been living a hidden life so at odds with his role. Throughout the trial, Lucia maintained a cold and unrepentant demeanor. Her statements painted her as a woman who had been abandoned, betrayed by a man she had trusted. She portrayed herself as the victim of a love that had turned sour, a woman who had nothing left to lose. The jury watched her carefully, their expressions hardening with each contradiction in her story, each revelation that pointed to a calculated act rather than a moment of desperation. By the May 15th, the trial reached its conclusion. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Lucia Morales was convicted of murder, her actions deemed too calculated to be forgiven as a crime of passion. The town was left to grapple with the reality of the scandal that had rocked their lives. The once vibrant community of St. Agnes became a somber place. The church itself, now a reminder of the secrets that had festered within its walls. The townspeople struggled to rebuild their faith, haunted by the memory of Father Mateo, the man they had trusted, and the woman who had turned his life into a tragedy. St. Agnes Church, once a place of solace and hope, became a quiet, empty shell, its congregation scattered and wary, their belief in the sanctity of the church forever marred. Albuquerque was left to grapple with the legacy of a scandal that would forever change the way they looked at faith, trust, and betrayal. Make sure to check out a similar case like the case where a housewife's affair with priest shocked the community. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on our daily updates.